Hello, hello. Welcome, everyone. Looks like we have people filing into the virtual room, so we'll give it just a second to get everybody in here. We're really glad to have you joining us today for this Ready Set first session of the Ready Set Grant series. Look forward to getting to know all of you a little bit better. Okay, I think we're ready to get started since we only have 2 hours and a lot of stuff to cover today. I'm just going to get rolling. So the first thing I'd like you to do is I want to welcome you to say hello in the chat. Part of what we'd like to do today is have you get to know each other a little bit. So just tell us your name, and if you represent a particular community or community organization, let us know that too. Ask you to please stay muted when you're not speaking. Keep your camera on when you can. I always joke that it's really nice to see people's faces, and so that I don't feel like I'm sitting here in this room talking to myself. So if you can, appreciate that. And then I used to say, please make sure to have some kind of pen and paper or something to take notes, but now I know people do this in a variety of different ways in our world. So I just would advise you that you're at some point will need to take notes to complete some of the exercises, so that you might want to have something available to do that. I will say that we are only 2 hours today, so I don't have a scheduled break as part of these sessions, but obviously please take care of your needs as they arise. So just a little bit about rural development initiatives. We have been around for over 30 years and work in Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. I know we have folks in the room from all 3 of those states, plus one from California, so we're excited to have you here. My name is Jennifer Groth, and I am the Director of Policy and Partnerships for Rural Development Initiatives, or RDI as we call ourselves. And I've been working for, I don't want to date myself too much, but a lot of decades in fundraising, grant writing, and fund development. So I'm happy to be here with you today. I also want to introduce a couple of my colleagues who are here from RDI as well. One is Freya Hendrickson, who is sort of my partner in crime in this class. She is our Impacted Networks Manager, and she and I do this course together. And then a new staff person at RDI, Kendra Schaefer, who is listening in to see how we do this and learn a little bit about grants. So you're welcome to check out our website at rdiinc.org if you want more details about rural development initiatives. We also have a partner in this effort called Kelly Nonprofit Consulting, and they are a very experienced consultancy in terms of supporting nonprofits with fundraising, with fund development, with board development, and a variety of other topics. And they've been really successful and have a great staff that we work with frequently. Here's a picture of their team. They did add somebody for this session. Hesper is from Washington, and the rest of these folks are in Oregon, so that we'll have some Washington representation on the crew here. So let me explain how Kelly Nonprofit's going to be involved in this particular training. What we're going to provide, RDI is going to provide over these 5 sessions, is a pretty high level overview on a lot of different topics related to how your organization can be better positioned to increase revenue. And we're going to focus on grant writing for certain. However, if you are in a position where you have a particular project in mind and you're here because you're trying to build a playground, or you're trying to get a new program started, and you know exactly what you're trying to get out of this course in terms of your project, it may be helpful to you to get some one-on-one support, and Kelly Nonprofit Consulting can provide that. So she can take up to 8 organizations. They can take, for each of those 8 organizations, you can get up to 10 hours of one-on-one mentoring. And additionally, if there are people who just need to talk to Kristen or a member of her staff for like an hour on a specific topic, like tell me more about how to grow my board, for example, she's also available to do that. So we'll be talking more about this particular opportunity throughout all of the sessions. I will tell you that a lot of people who have taken this class really appreciated being able to spend some time with this crew. So it's a really great benefit of the class, and it's free. It doesn't cost anything. The grant that we have that pays for us to do this also pays for her time. So She is going to provide a link to an interest survey that I will send you in a follow-up email after this, and you can let her know what your needs are and she can connect with you. So who do we have in the room today? We have a really great cross-section of humans from 42 communities. I mentioned that we have people from 4 states. We have 26 counties represented, a lot of different community organizations in terms of the sectors that you're in, including health, education, economic development, senior services, a lot of people doing work with food insecurity. And I also will say that in the interest, that the survey that you filled out when you registered, that we have people with a variety of different levels of expertise, from never having seen a grant before, don't know anything about it, all the way up to describing themselves as expert. I will tell you that the preponderance of people who signed up for this class are more on the beginner side or completely new to the topic. So these sessions are going to be more focused on people who are, I would describe as beginners. However, I will say that we learn something every time we do these classes. And if you are a person who has more experience in grant writing or in fundraising and you want to contribute to the conversation in terms of your expertise, we would be more than happy to hear from you. It's always great to get a lot of voices in the room talking about, you know, different things that happen when you're trying to raise money for your organization. Also, I will mention that this class is particularly geared to nonprofit organizations because those are usually the types of organizations that write grants, but we also get public entities like school districts or cities or things like that, water districts in the room. And so there will be some applicability there, but most of the time we'll be talking about nonprofits. Okay, so why are we doing this? Why does RDI teach grant writing class? RDI usually works at a community level in rural places in the Pacific Northwest, and we are really interested in getting more funding to those places to help you achieve your goals for your community and to become the kind of place that you envision that you want to live. As a result of that, we try to focus on things that will help you get the resources you need. So we're going to be talking about things like getting your organization ready for funding, the importance of partnerships. We're going to talk about planning for revenue, and also obviously the ability to create competitive funding proposals. This particular session today is more focused on your organizational health and how to get yourself positioned as an organization that funders care about. The next session will be about budgeting. The third one is about funder research and how to find sources. And then the fourth session is about just the basics of the basic components of a grant and how to work through that. The fifth session is usually the most popular. We invite some foundations to come and talk to us about how their grant process works, and you're going to be able to ask them questions about that. And it's really great to just hear from them, from their perspective on this topic. Okay, so let's get to know each other a little bit. One of the questions we asked you as part of registration is what you hope to gain from this training. I want to give you a second opportunity to mention in the chat the kinds of things that you're thinking that you want to get out of this, just because honestly, we do pay attention to what you tell us, and we do try to tailor the sessions to specific topics that you raise as part of this. So let us know in the chat what you think, and we'll make sure that we consider that as part of our preparation for subsequent sessions. Just to give you an idea, you can see on the screen a few things that people said, but some other responses. People want to understand how to define outcomes, measure success. They want to learn about where to find sources of funding that are a good fit for their organizations, how to create a good budget, how to handle overhead costs. They want to learn about what kind of criteria funders use to decide whether they should fund your project or not. And also learning about how to make grant administration and reporting, which are the non-sexy aspects of grants. In other words, after you get the grant, how do you track it, and how do you report your success after you receive it? So those are some of the things that we heard as part of the registration. So I'm just looking through the chat real quick just to see what other people are saying. Playground, yay! We actually have a playground exercise in a future session, so we'll be all over that. And then how much to ask for? That's a really good question. We will cover that. Great. Oh, perfect. So we'll save these comments and make sure to talk about them in a future session, but I appreciate the input on that. So keep them coming. Okay, so the other thing we usually do, RDI usually works with groups in rural. So we pull people together and we either teach skills or we have conversations to reach consensus about community priorities. So we're always pulling people together. And as a result of that, we make it a practice to talk about group norms. So you can see on the screen here that we're essentially trying to create an environment where everybody feels comfortable and respected. And we want to make sure that you are able to ask questions without feeling intimidated about it. We want to make sure that you feel comfortable sharing your stories and that you're being respectful to one another and listening to learn. In addition, I will say that part of the training that we're doing here, we do a lot of, during each session, we break you out into small groups to have conversations because, as you know, sometimes we learn as much from the people that we're participating with as you do from me. And so the only thing I would say, Freya has asked me to mention that if you are unable to participate in a breakout because you have, your kids are acting up or you're in the car or something happens and you're not able to join, if you could just let her know in advance of the small group discussions by just shooting her a chat. And the reason for that is if we break you out into small groups and then some poor human ends up in a group and nobody's there, they don't get the benefit of that conversation. So that was just one thing we wanted to mention about the small group discussions. Okay, so we talked about what we're going to cover overall in all the 5 sessions, and what are we going to hit on today? As I mentioned earlier, today is about organization readiness. It's about how you demonstrate your organizational health to a potential funder. So we're going to talk about mission vision, DEI. We're going to talk about the things you need to have in place to get ready to create a request for funding, talk about the board of directors of your organization, talk about how you plan to create a program, and then how do you evaluate that it's successful. And then we're going to wrap up with sort of the first piece of the grant puzzle, which is summary statements and case statements. So that's the quick and dirty of what we're going to do today. So we're going to go ahead and just launch. Finding your passion. Doesn't that sound dramatic? What is she going to say about that? Okay, so as we all know, because many of you work very hard as community volunteers or as staff members for community-based organizations that do great work in your rural place, we know this is hard work. And we know that we're constantly scrambling for funding. So why do we do this? We do it because we care about improving our community. We care about the quality of life for the people who live in our place. We can be passionate about community overall, but it's more likely that we have a particular interest that keeps us going, whether that be things like child welfare, family wage jobs, the arts, the natural beauty of our place. What I want to say on this slide is that your passion for your work is honestly the single most valuable asset you have for your organization's success. The rest of what we're going to talk about is just a framework that allows us to pursue what we care about. When you're raising money, your passion is what gets potential donors and grant funders excited to partner with you. But they have to not only understand the why of what you do, in other words, why are you passionate about this? Why do you care about this? But they're also going to have to feel comfortable about the how. And that's what we're going to also talk about a little bit today. In other words, the way that you are advancing your passion or your mission is important to them. In other words, are you a going concern? Are you a healthy organization? Do you have good financials? Do you have a path forward that makes sense? So passion contributes to exciting grant proposals and compelling funding requests. And these are some of the tools on the screen here that you can see that help us uncover what your why is. Mission and vision, goal setting, and then diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we're going to hit those topics today. So many of you who have been in the nonprofit world for a long time are very familiar with the concept of a mission statement. A funder will ask you what your mission statement is as part of a grant proposal. So it behooves us to sit with this concept for a second here. If you have a mission statement, is it short and simple? Is it clear? There is a tendency sometimes for organizations to get a little wordy and a little sentency in their mission and vision, and it's better if you can kind of condense it into something concise and clear. A vision statement is what you want the future to be for your organization. Vision statements are less common, not necessarily something that you get asked about in a grant application, but it's still something that may help you improve the path forward for your community organization. One of the people who took this class in the past told me something interesting about vision statements. They said that some organizations find that creating actual concrete images for a vision statement is helpful. And my favorite one they mentioned was in the 1960s, NASA had a vision which was to put a man on the moon. Super clear vision statement. And then they said that their downtown association had sort of translated that into hearing tinkling bells on doors as customers enter businesses. That's their vision statement. That's what they want to be. So the mission statement is more about now and more about what your organization's objectives and approach to reach those objectives is, and the vision is kind of what you want the future to be. So if you either don't have a mission statement for your organization, or if you don't like the one that you have, the easiest way to get started is to investigate mission or vision statements from similar organizations. Sometimes it helps to get a small group of people together and just brainstorm words that you think are about that define your mission. And then and the other thing I want you to think about is determining where this information is displayed or for the benefit of the culture of your group. In other words, if you create a mission and then you don't put it on your website, or if you have a physical place, if you don't post it somewhere in your physical place, how will people be continually reminded that this is what you're about? So that's something to think about as well. So here's some examples of some mission statements. If you're still like, what the heck is Jennifer talking about? RDI's, for example, RDI's mission is to strengthen rural people, places, and economies in the Pacific Northwest. I'm particularly fond of that mission statement. The Kids Hope Center, a group we worked with last time, their mission statement was, the Kids Hope Center exists to reduce child abuse through community awareness, intervention, and to provide supports for healing and victim justice. There's a revitalization group in Glide that we work with pretty often in these classes. Their mission statement is revitalizing Glide and Douglas County by promoting economic growth, beautification, recreation, and education, while building strength and resiliency in our residents through community outreach, program development, and enrichment activities. So those are just some examples. The other thing to think about the other reason we pay so much attention to mission in this particular session is because, you know, we just went through a pretty challenging time the last few years, and a lot of nonprofits were really in the thick of that, providing services, and a lot of groups had to pivot. Are we sick of that word yet? Had to pivot and do something different than what they did before the pandemic, right? And so this is sort of an opportunity for you to take a step back and say, okay, this is the organization we've been for the last however many years. Is it still what we used to be? Does our mission still make sense, or are we doing something completely different? So that's just something to think about. So we're going to break out into our first small group discussion. I will say that this slide isn't visible in your small group, so you can either take a picture of it. Freya usually will put the sentences in the chat after you break out, so if you forget what the questions are, you can look in the chat and see them there as well. I want you to just sort of introduce yourselves to one another, just to get to know each other a little bit, but also talk about your mission statement. Like, do you have one? Do you don't have one? Do you like it? You don't like it? Has it shifted as a result of the pandemic? And what ways can you think of to keep your staff and your board focused on the mission and vision, to communicate that to potential funders, to make sure that you are imbuing the mission and vision into your organizational culture? So is it on your website? Is it posted somewhere? Do you put it on your newsletter, et cetera, et cetera? So I'm going to stop talking. Freya, are you ready for us to break out?
I am, yes. I'm going to open the rooms now.
Welcome back, everybody. I hope that you were able to have some good discussions about what the heck your organization was about. Does anybody have any questions or want to come off mute and share something that was particularly compelling about their breakout session? I'll just give you a minute if you want to. Don't have to, can also put it in the chat.
I have a question, Jennifer.
Mm-hmm.
Is it important to have the name of the organization actually in the mission statement?
That's a good question. I've never had that question before. I would say probably not.
Okay.
I'm trying to think of the context. So when I think of mission statements, I think of a funding application where somebody is asking you for your mission statement. So you wouldn't need it in that context because you were already told them somewhere else in the grant application who you were. The other thing is on your website, you're assuming if somebody came to your website that they already know who you are. At your physical location, you're assuming that they know who you are already. So I guess that my gut feeling is no. Does anybody else have any other thoughts?
Well, from a marketing perspective, repetition is always good. So we have our name in the mission and vision statement in there.
Yeah.
Just a repetition.
Yeah, the repetition is a good point as well. So sometimes it just depends on what you think works best for the context of what you're using the sentence for. So thanks for that.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other thoughts that you have? Throw in the chat and we'll keep going here.
Quick question in the chat, actually, Jennifer.
Yep. I'm
asking
sorry.
about their organization has rewritten their mission and the new one has 4 bullet points of focus topics.
Oh my gosh.
So just asking about thoughts on bulleted breakdown of the mission statement.
They're asking about what?
Thoughts on a bulleted breakdown in a mission statement.
I don't think it's a bad idea. My guess is if you're going to bullets, your mission statement might be too long. So that's just a gut reaction. But if that seems to be working for you and provides clarity to your organization, then more power to you. I will say that on a lot of grant applications, you may not have enough room because as for those of you who have done grant applications before, there's this thing called word limits and character limits. And fighting with those sometimes can be a lot of fun, but if they only give you, 10 words to write your mission statement and you have bullet points, you're probably not going to get there. So that's also something to think about. Did we have a question or comment from Rachel?
Yeah, so I'm fairly new as the executive director. I definitely see how our mission statement, it's way too long. It causes our organization to lose focus. I was wondering if you could give me some additional reasons just to help explain to the board why we need to condense it, because I anticipate some resistance.
Yeah, I can understand that, Rachel. I mean, people try to put the kitchen sink in there, and that is a common tendency, I think, when it comes to mission statements. And we're actually going to talk about being concise a little bit further along today, too, when we talk about summary statements. When you are dealing with a foundation funder, when you are dealing with a large donor that wants to know what you're about, you have to be able to say it clearly in one sentence so that they understand. So we have to think about the fact that our audience doesn't necessarily know our work. Does that make sense? And also that our audience may not have the attention span to listen to a whole paragraph when they are learning about what you do. So being able to, there are other ways you can dive into more detail about what your organization does, but the mission statement is not the place to do it. Does that help you? Does that provide a little bit more? Okay, great. Good conversations. I appreciate you guys considering this topic so carefully. So now we're going to move on from the why a little bit and talk about the how. So now you've thought about your mission statement, you thought about what your vision is for your organization. The next piece of the puzzle then is how are you going to achieve that? And what a lot of organizations will do is create something called a strategic plan. A strategic plan is basically a list of goals that your organization wants to achieve in a certain time period, and underneath each goal, the activities or programs that are going to get you there. For those of you for which strategic plan sounds like a scary thing you don't want to do, you can also consider just some kind of an annual goal setting exercise where you and your board are getting together to create some goals for the year and decide how you're going to accomplish them. We're not going to cover strategic planning or goal setting in a lot of detail today because that's a whole class. And we can talk about where you might find resources to learn more about strategic planning. But I will say that, again, just like we said about the mission statement, you're going to, if you don't have a strategic plan or a list of goals right now, you might look at other organizations like yours to see if they have a strategic plan or a list of goals just to get yourself something started. The other thing that people do if they're going through a strat plan process is to interview partners that you work with, your staff, your board members, community leaders, the people you serve, and just have some conversations about what you think with them about what they think the organization should be doing, and have that sort of inform a plan. Typically, goal setting or strategic planning is a 2 to 3 year time frame. Anything longer than that, and you're just looking through a crystal ball, and it's not very useful. Some people try to create 5 years or longer strategic plans, and my personal opinion is that they're not super useful. So keeping your plan to every 2 or 3 years is good. If you're just getting started on this, maybe just do an annual one. So the reason that strategic planning is important is because the person who's asking you for money might ask you for how it is that this particular grant that you're asking for fits into your organization's mission and strategic plan, or mission and goals. And you have to be able to articulate that. Say something like, our board went through a goal setting process. We have established that this is one of our goals. Our board has approved the plan, and this is how this program fits into it, or this is how this particular project fits into it. So it helps to have some kind of a framework like that. I want to pivot a little bit to talk about whether or not how you're making sure that the programs or the services you provide are inclusive of all populations. We're going to cover diversity, equity, and inclusion in a little bit more detail. Recent events over the past few years, as you know, have made organizations more aware of the importance of this topic, particularly as it relates to how you manage your organization and also how you approach fundraising. We're going to talk about some definitions. We're going to provide you with a little tool you can use to assess how you're doing with diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then we're going to have a little bit of a small group discussion around this topic so that you guys can trade ideas with one another. The other thing I will say before we get into this conversation is one reason we talk about it is because it's an important part of a healthy organization to be paying attention to whether or not you're being inclusive. However, I will also say that most funding applications will have a question about this on there. So it helps for you to spend some time thinking about how your organization deals with diversity, equity, and inclusion in terms of funding applications as well. So let's just define some terms first. So you can see on the screen a definition of diversity referring to the richness of human differences. It has a long list of things that could qualify as aspects of diversity. I have asked in previous classes people to add to this list if there are things that they think are missing. I've heard about things like neurodiversity or immigration status, for example. If there's other things that you all can think of that should fit into this definition, please feel free to throw it in the chat. When you are trying to attack the concept of diversity for your organization or for your group, think about how you can gather demographic data to find out what groups you aren't reaching. Do you have access to what the demographics of your community are, or what the demographics are of the people you serve? And are there differences there that you need to pay attention to? The other thing that you could think about is understanding the history of your organization or the history of your community. It kind of helps you think about what your past has been as an organization and how you might shift that going forward in terms of including the full spectrum of diversity in your community or as part of the sector you serve. So the next term is inclusion. Inclusion is about active, intentional, ongoing engagement with diversity. It's creating a climate or culture, kind of like what we talked about with the mission statement. It fosters belonging and respect. People feel like you're an accessible organization. When you think about how you might address this in your organization, think about how are you reaching out to people to let them know about your services? Are you just doing the internet, and some people don't have access to the internet? Are you not providing the things, the service information in more than one language? Are there communities are there like Spanish speaking communities in your rural place that might benefit from seeing the information you're providing in Spanish? The other thing to think about, and this is something that you also might get asked about in a grant application, is what's the composition of your board of directors and what's the composition of your staff? Does it represent the people that you serve? And then the last concept we'll talk about is equity. Equity can be a little bit more challenging to wrap your head around if it's new to you. I think this particular image is one that many of you maybe have seen before, but it sort of demonstrates the difference between equality and equity. In the simplest terms, equity means fairness, which is not necessarily the same thing as equality. It's not about everybody getting the same thing. It's about everybody getting what they need in order to access opportunities to improve their situation. Freya has a link she can share in the chat if you guys want to dive deeper into this particular topic after we're finished today. A couple of examples of equity I thought might be helpful. So in education, equality means providing every student with the same experience. Equity, however, means overcoming challenges faced by specific groups of people, like defined by race, by gender, or by other types of different experiences. Another example would be a city is forced to cut the budget for its police substations. Cutting the operational hours for all the substations by the same amount would be a solution that represents equality. Equity, on the other hand, would be for the city to first determine which neighborhoods actually use their substations the most and reduce the hours of less often used locations. So this is just a list on the screen here of some other ideas that we can give you if you're thinking about strategies to approach diversity, equity, and inclusion for your organization that you might consider. So just some brainstorming here. You could consider having a DEI statement that demonstrates your commitment to that topic. You could have an internal structure like an advisory group or a committee of the board whose goal it is to address these kinds of issues and make sure that you are continuing to improve. You can post materials in something other than English, as we already mentioned. You could have it as a goal to get some kind of cultural competency training. Partnerships is a great way to advance your strategies here. In other words, if we provide after school services to a particular, to the community, and we don't feel like we're doing great outreach to the Latino community, then we might want to develop a partnership with a Latino serving organization to see if they're interested in our services. And then allocating resources for engagement and outreach for communities that are underrepresented. So why should we care about this? It's important, I think, to make sure all populations in the community have access to your programs and services. I think that you'll find that it improves outreach to your programs. It increases your donor pool. So the more people that you're able to connect with on their basic, what's the phrase now they say? Meet them where they're at. The more people you can meet where they're at, the larger your donor pool will be. It also opens the door to a lot of really cool opportunities for partnerships. As I mentioned before, donors and funders might ask you for your approach to DEI. They might ask you for a plan. I don't see that as often, but they'll probably ask you to write a paragraph about what your experience is with this topic. What I will say is that if this is a topic that is completely new to you in terms of your organization, don't panic. What, in my experience, funders want to see is that you're making some kind of an effort. You can acknowledge, you're like, we're just getting started on this. Here are the types of things that we're thinking about doing. Here are our plans for trying to improve our outreach and be more inclusive and understand the diversity of our place. They don't expect you to be perfect. They don't expect you to be evolved, or they expect that you're trying. Does that make sense? And to be able to explain that in a way that is authentic. So as I mentioned earlier, we do have a tool that we can use. Meyer Memorial Trust is a funder a big funder in Oregon, and they have created this particular tool that helps organizations sort of evaluate where they are. And essentially what it is a survey that's a series of questions, and you can see this continuum on the bottom of the screen here. And and the response to each one of the questions, how would you define yourself? Are you not yet started? Have you launched? Are you leading and other people are copying what you're doing? And as you answer the questions, it sort of helps you do a gut check of, oh, here's an area where we could do some work, or here's where we're doing okay, and we can tell and we can brag about it and say we're excited about what we're doing in this particular area, but we need help here. And I think you will find that this tool can just help you write that paragraph that you need for the proposal, but it'll also help you sort of start a conversation in your organization, because this conversation can sometimes be difficult, that says, you know, as part of the grant proposals that we're writing, we need to have a conversation about how our organization is addressing this topic. And here are some places where we think we could do better. Here are some places where we think we're doing great. Okay. So Freya's going to put a link into the chat, and we'll also provide this in the post email after this session. So you'll have it again for you to take that survey and see if it helps you with this particular topic. Okay. So we're going to break into a small group again. And I think that in addition, if you end up with a different crew this time, and hopefully you do a little bit, have an opportunity to introduce yourselves to one another. And then also talk about the questions on the screen here is, what can you do like in the next 30 days to get yourself rolling on this if this is completely new to you? Or what can you do if you're already working on this to take your organization to, you know, to the next step? And then I really want some great brainstorming around what other groups or organizations can I connect with to help me. This is a tremendous, I'm going to talk about partnerships until your eyes get crossed. You're going to be like, stop talking about partnerships, Jennifer. But this is a super great opportunity to do that. And so I'd love you to consider what other groups in your community you can work with together to help you with this. Okay. Freya, are you ready?
I am ready. Yes, I'm opening the rooms up now.
Okay, thank you.
Constantly revolving and changing.
It is. Yeah, I think that's fair to say. Does anybody else have any experience they want to share with that?
Well, I agree that it does constantly evolve and change, just because I think it's part of, it's so human driven. But I also think something that was really brought up for me with this, and actually was texting our executive director, I'm like, I don't know what's our strategy. There's nothing written out. And so just saying that we're inclusive isn't enough. Just because we have we welcome everybody statement on the door, that's not a strategy. She's like, well, that's our current strategy. I'm like, that's not a strategy. It's not an action. It's saying something, you know, that it could just be for show. And so I think what this has really brought up for me is just the importance of having an actual plan, strategy, and statement that all, you know, that we can stand behind and are very action oriented.
Yeah, and that feels authentic, like it feels like you're really doing something and not just saying things.
Not just saying, yeah, it's pretty to put you know, a flag on your door, or to have a Black Lives Matter thing, which are all important things, but I don't want it to be posturing. I'd rather it be something that people can see that we're actually standing behind, you know.
I think in my experience with some of this in my previous nonprofit, I felt like we had plenty of diversity in our employees, but not in the leadership structure, which is pretty common. But employees would have a voice and have ideas, and it would like typically get shot down or watered down so much that it never happened. And we had all the committees and things that were happening and plans and meetings, but it didn't feel like things changed at all. And I think the thing to remember if you're in leadership positions is that it is going to be inconvenient and difficult probably to actually make something better or different. So you can have a million excuses, but like, if you want to make something different, it's going to mean actual change that's going to be difficult and inconvenient, and creative. So you can't, you know, and I just feel like there's so much when something like that needs to happen that it's like, it gets so watered down that it's because it's too inconvenient. And of course, no one would say that, and everyone's is committed. But when the rubber meets the road, it's like, we'll
Yeah.
meet on that, you know?
Well, but Audrey, I think you're bringing up an important point that we probably need to raise here, which is this is hard.
It's so hard.
Let's all acknowledge that this is hard. So it's and like Allison said, sometimes it feels like things change, you know, as you're trying to do things, then the expectations change, and sometimes that's hard. And this is also, I think, a particular area of organizational theory or management that is moving fast. And so let's all just acknowledge that. But I agree that it's still something that we have to pay attention to because it makes organizations better. I think paying attention to it also makes the community we serve more appreciative of the fact that we are trying to reach out to all sectors of the community. And I think that funders will appreciate the fact that you are doing the hard work. And I think they also recognize that it's hard. And that's why I think they're more interested in the try than the perfect, if that makes sense. Any other comments or questions on this topic?
I think you're absolutely right about having outward facing information that speaks to our commitment, like the dual language things. And I also think that it is ever changing. We work in a rural area, and we talk about low to moderate income small business owners and them getting equitable access to some of the funding and some of the things that are out there. So it means something different in each area that somebody's going to serve. And so kind of educating people as you're writing grants too, who are the people that are affected most in the population that you're speaking to. And what does that look like? There's just not as many resources in rural areas as there are in more populated areas. So that was one thing. And then we also talked about what other groups or organizations can I connect with to help me. I think that's so important because we can all be great listeners. I was sharing that we use the Small Business Administration, that monthly calendar that they highlight Black History Month, they highlight LGBTQ owned businesses. So we use that as our guideline each month as we send out a constant contact as an organization, and use their verbiage, you know, very much, you don't have to reinvent the wheel, you can just use that information. And just it's a good filter to always have up so that you can be, you know, messaging in these. And again, it's a rural area, so these kinds of messages are sometimes newer.
Mm-hmm. The other good point, Kim, that I think you're bringing up that I want to make sure to reiterate is a lot of times people think funders have all the right answers and you're just trying to figure out what the right answer is to tell them. Does that make sense? But in rural, particularly, there is a validity to saying, I have expertise in my rural community and I'm going to explain what diversity, equity, inclusion looks like in my place. And that is part of, you know, a funder can learn from you. And that's another interesting thing to a perspective to take when you're writing a grant proposal or when you're approaching a funder. So thank you for that. May, did you have a question or a comment?
I was just also going to comment. Hi, Kim. I worked with him when I did RARE the first time.
Oh, nice.
But just kind of piggyback off what she was talking about, I think another way to look at inclusion in particular is with the organizations that you reach out with. Efforts in serving various populations, especially in large rural counties, can be very siloed a lot of times, and a lack of collaboration. There can be competition for funding, and or it's just geographical. So I do a lot of kind of being the glue between organizations and my work, and because I'll go out and I'll talk to Reedsport, who really doesn't resonate or relate to Roseburg, and Glide would prefer to be tucked up there all alone. And so doing inclusion with your collaboration is also very important. And that's how you reduce redundancy and build those bridges that you can better serve all the populations across a very dispersed county.
That's great, May. And we're going to hit partnerships a lot harder in one of the future sessions because it's one of my favorite things to talk about. So thanks for bringing that in too. Okay, thanks for all the good comments. Anything else, please throw in the chat. I'm going to keep us moving forward onto the next exciting topic in organizational readiness, which is board governance. So Let's talk about your board of directors for a bit. Now, some of you are staff members, some of you are board members. There are nonprofits I know, especially in rural, that have no staff. So in that case, we're just talking about the board. So there's a different kind of relationship depending on the composition of your organization. So I just want to make sure I call that out. Here are the things I think that are important to know about board governance for your organization as it relates to revenue and fundraising. First of all, board members have an absolute responsibility to act as fiduciaries, which means they are responsible for your organization's finances and overseeing them. If your board members are currently reviewing financial reports at their meeting and evaluating policy and approving budgets related to the money coming in and out of your organization, that's great. If they're not, it's something to pay attention to. The board needs to be aware of what is happening with your organization financially. That is part of their job. What I would say about fundraising is what I often see is there's this sort of conflict where between board and staff, where the staff thinks it's the board's responsibility to raise money and the board thinks it's the staff's responsibility to raise money. And of course, the answer is both. It's just in terms of the roles that you play. So some thoughts to chew on here. Board members can be useful partners in raising revenues for the organization, very useful. However, their activities should be centrally managed by staff. And I can give you a really obvious example of why, which is you don't want two board members asking the same person for money. So there needs to be some central coordination of who we're requesting funds from and how that's happening. The other thing to think about is a lot of organizations keep a board roster. So you have a list of everybody on your board. You have a list of where they work or what their day jobs are. But do you have a list of their additional affiliations? In other words, is the accountant on your board also a member of the Rotary Club or also work for United Way or also, you know what I mean? Because those are the leads that will help you connect to sources of funding. Number one, they are also the leads that will help you connect to potential partners. And that board member can be a liaison and make those introductions for you. So think about the idea of instead of just maintaining a list of who's on your board, also asking them to let you know what their other affiliations in the community are. Like what are all their other hats they're wearing, which in small towns, we know we all wear 20 hats, right? So it's a helpful thing in terms of having a resource for partnerships and for funding. The other thing I will say is if you're going to go ask somebody for funding, or if you're going to go on a site visit for a grant for a particular program or project you're working on, usually the way it works best is the person you're approaching has the perspective of both the board and the staff. And the way that typically looks is, let's say the local car dealership in your community wants to give you some money and somebody on your board is connected with them somehow. So that board member gives you the connection. So that board member would attend a meeting in which you would ask the car dealership for funding, right? And then you would be there to provide sort of the nuts and bolts and say, we serve this many people. This is our annual budget. What questions can I answer for you about how our programs work? The board member is sitting there saying, I am a big supporter of this organization. I give to this organization. I think you should too. And those are two very valuable perspectives to have in that meeting. So that's an example of what you would do for an individual donor. The same is probably true of when you have a grant meeting, when somebody is considering you for a grant and they want to come and visit your site. They want the board perspective and they want the staff perspective. Sometimes in grant meetings, they would also love to have a client perspective in that room as well. So the other thing to think about with the composition of your board, we already talked about, does your board represent communities and the community and those you serve? The other thing to think about is what skills you need for your organization that might be on your board. And I think those of you who have a lot of nonprofit experience understand what I'm saying here. Do you have an accountant on your board or somebody who can help you with your finances? Do you have an attorney on your board if you feel like you need legal help? Do you have somebody who's familiar with architecture, construction, something around the building maintenance, or if you're working on a campaign to build a new building, having that expertise on your board is helpful. So just some things to think about. Is there a question? Did I see a hand up?
You did, but Jennifer, really quickly, because I'm at a school, when you say staff, that just got me confused, because when I think of staff, it's the teachers. So when you say staff, that would probably just be like the executive director, just, it should only be a couple, right? Because staff for us is teachers.
Right. And I mean, there may be in some situations, if you're asking for a grant for a particular program that a teacher is in charge of, it might be that the meeting would include a board member, the director, plus the teacher who is doing the program. So it sort of depends on the situation, but I would say that as a default, yes, it's the executive director and the board member who would be involved in funding.
Thank you.
Okay. So let's talk about grant readiness and some things that you can do, just nuts and bolts, to get yourself ready to be available for funding opportunities when they arise. The one point I want to make in this section, or something to think about as just an overarching question, this is very simple, but I think sometimes it provides some clarity about fundraising in general. Can you answer the question, if you were to walk to the grocery store and somebody came up to you and say, hey, I know that you work for Glide Revitalization. What do you guys need funding for? Not that somebody would say that in the grocery store, but you know what I mean. What do you guys need? For you to be able to answer that question with specific requests that include dollar amounts is a really powerful tool. And a lot of us sometimes just keep doing our day-to-day jobs and we don't necessarily step back and think about the what do you need question. And that may be something valuable for you to think about as we continue this conversation. So the first thing that we have here, I'm calling it a scavenger hunt. That's sort of a tongue-in-cheek title. Apologies for that. One of the things that happens sometimes when you're asked to pull a grant together is all of a sudden you have to find everything on this list. And it's not all in the same place. I'm not saying that that's a universal truth, but sometimes that happens. And I think what I would like to suggest is that you think about having all of the basic organization documents that you need to apply for a grant and have them all in one place and have them backed up. And because there's a lot of turnover in nonprofits, making sure that more than one person has it on their computer. So let's talk about what some of these things are. So if you're a nonprofit, you will have a letter from the IRS that indicates you are a 501c3 charitable organization. There are maybe some people in this room who are not 501c3s because they are public entities, because there's other designations of nonprofit called 501c4, 501c6 that are common. Most foundations that you are applying to for grants will require you to be a 501c3. If you are not, you can partner with a 501c3 and they can apply on your behalf as a fiscal sponsor. So we can talk more about that if you have questions about it. The other thing to find is your articles of incorporation. When you were formed as a nonprofit, legally, you're required to file articles of incorporation with your state. For those of you who are looking at applying for federal grants, there is this thing called a SAM registration. SAM stands for System of Award Management. It takes a while to get this if you're applying for federal grants. So if that's something you're thinking about doing, I would suggest starting that like this afternoon. They will also ask you for something called a UEI number, which is a unique entity identifier number. If you are just getting started in the grant world, I would say just stay away from federal grants for a while. But if this is a leap that you're getting ready to make, then make sure that you have those two things. We already talked about the fact that they're going to ask you for a board roster, and they also going to ask you for some financial information about your organization. I am seeing fewer and fewer foundations ask for an annual audit, which is great because those are expensive to get, particularly for small nonprofits. But if you do have an audit and you're able to provide it, it demonstrates the financial health of your organization. Sometimes people ask for the Form 990, which is the tax form that nonprofits have to fill out with the IRS every year. You don't pay taxes, but you do have to report your income and expenses. So they may ask you for that as well. And then I would say the most popular thing they're going to ask for to determine your organizational health is your annual budget. So you will need to have that in a location where you can produce it pretty quickly. The other thing, this is sort of a joke here at the bottom, super bonus extra credit, is if you can find your state certificate of good standing. This is again for federal grants. If you're not getting into federal grants, don't worry about it. Do we have anybody in the room who is not a 501c3? Or if you don't know, it's okay, but I'm just curious if we need to talk about fiscal sponsors a little more, or if you guys are good.
I'd have to check our status, but I do not believe we are a 501c at this time.
Okay, and that is okay. What I would tell you in terms of a small bit of advice is some people decide that they need to be a 501c3. I would caution you to step back and make sure that that's where you want to go, because a lot of our communities are full of 501c3s. And this is just, in my opinion, an opportunity to partner. So if there's an organization that you know in your community that does similar work that you do, or would want to support the work you do, then they can, you can fill out the grant application for funding, and then they submit it under their IRS tax ID number. The only thing that I would recommend is that you have some conversation with a fiscal sponsor about whether they want to charge you for that service. In other words, do they want to take a little bit of a couple $100s off the grant to keep track of the financial, or do they want you to keep track of the financial if you get it? I'm just saying it's not necessarily uncomplicated conversation, but it's really helpful to have a partner if you don't have 501c3 status. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you.
All right. Okay, the next thing to think about. Okay, so we talked about your mission and vision, and we talked about your strategic plan, and now we have this list of things that we want to do to meet our organization goals, right? And so we're ready to plan some programs or to plan some projects. So make sure, because you will certainly be asked this as part of a funding application, how does the program or the project that you want to do connect to your goals or your strategic plan, and be able to articulate that. So just think of a through line. Your overarching thing is your mission and vision. Underneath that is your organization's strategic plan. And underneath that are the programs and activities that you're doing. And those all should be able to be related to one another, if that makes sense. The other thing to think about is, let's say you get a grant. First of all, make sure you have a big party and say, yay, we got a grant, because that's exciting news, and always celebrate that because it doesn't always happen. And it also is a great validation of the work you do. Then you have to sit down and say, how are you going to measure the success of these programs? Because a year from now, because most grants give you funding for a year, you're going to have to explain how that funding helped you. And I can tell you, mostly because I am a person who has been in this situation in my life, the sad thing that happens is you get to the end of a grant period and you're like, oh no, I have a report due in 2 weeks. How am I going to explain my success? So the more planning you put into how you're going to say what kind of, in other words, are you going to say it's because you had this many people participate in your program? Are you going to say that you had this many people who access services? Are you going to say, you know, if it's a challenge grant, that you raised a certain amount of money as a result of the funding that you received? There's a variety of ways you could measure it, but just make sure you know how to measure it. The other thing to think about here is the reason we talked about having your programs relate to your strategic plan, relate to your mission, is there's this thing in the nonprofit world called chasing funding. And what that is you see a grant opportunity come out and they say, we are providing funding for after school programs, and you don't have an after school program, but you're like, well, maybe if I start one, then I'll get some more money for our organization. If it's not part of your original goals and what you're doing, are you outside of your mission? In other words, and you're just trying to chase the money as opposed to sticking with what your organization is about. Does that make sense? That's not to say that sometimes we have things happen during a given year that divert us from what we thought we were going to accomplish, but let's just make sure that we're always having a conversation about, is this really what my organization is supposed to be doing? Beth is back. Beth, I didn't know you were in this class again. Hi.
Hi, I'm back. I wanted to say something about what you were just saying, because we have been known to mission drift on some of our funding, and the challenge with it is you get funding and then you have to continue to fund the program that you just created also. So if it doesn't fit your mission and there's no sustainable funding, then you're just continuing to chase funding on that. But also what we found is when we do our strategic planning, we say, okay, we want this program fits within our mission. And then like create a strategic plan of funding to become sustainable with that new program. So it's like piecing it. You know, do a 2-year grant that can then, and then an expansion comes, you know, in year 3 where you can add on funding to that same program. So like really think about if you're gonna add a new program because funding's available, make sure you have a way to sustain it in the future.
No, that's a really good point. And sometimes funders will ask you that question flat out. In other words, we're giving you this grant for a year, you're standing up this new program, you're paying staff with it. How are you gonna keep this going after this grant goes away? And that's a great question to sort of think through in terms of your program planning. And thank you, Beth. I'm also noticing we've got a lot of people in their cars. So this is a dedicated group. So let's talk about what comes next in terms of how to sort of set yourself up for what you want to get funded. I want you to think about if money is no object and you have to answer the question, what do you need? What you would say. So what I'd like you to do is take a minute and write down all the cool stuff that you want to do that you think is going to make your organization better, your community better. It's going to serve more people. It's going to make a difference, you know, making real change. So that could be repairs to a building or a piece of equipment. It could be supplies. It could be a whole new program. It could be a whole new building. Just something to think about for a minute or two. So consider the list that you think that you've got of a few things. You can keep going after. You don't have to stop if you're still writing stuff down. What 1 or 2 projects on there really rise to the top, either in terms of priority or because you would describe them as the proverbial low-hanging fruit, like you think you can accomplish this in a reasonable time frame. It feels attainable, if that makes sense. So what we're asking you to do here is go through an exercise, and this is kind of back to the conversation we had about your mission statement being concise. Can you explain this funding priority to a donor in 1 sentence? I want you to think about the summary statement as sort of a mission statement for the project or program that you're about to describe. It's a simple, brief way to explain your objective. And when we say simple, please understand that I understand that these sentences are not easy to write. Being clear and concise is not simple, but if we spend the time and the effort to do it, it pays dividends in terms of your ability to communicate your needs clearly to the people who might be able to help you. So this is just a slide that sort of gives some ideas on how to write that sentence. And I know it sounds crazy to spend this much time writing a sentence, but I think it's a really valuable exercise in terms of helping you think through what it is you're trying to accomplish with this project. So short and simple, make it something to make it memorable, also simple, you know, jargon free. You're an expert. The person who's listening to you might not be, so they might not understand your terminology. So make sure you pull all those words out. And then the hardest thing to do, but I think the thing that will really be most effective is if you can think in that sentence about what it is about the project that sets you apart. Are you the only organization in your community that serves seniors with meals? Did you recently celebrate a milestone that speaks to your the credibility of your organization, like you've been around for 3 decades? Did somebody in the community see you as an expert in this particular matter? This is the hardest part. This sets you apart, but it's the thing that will make your summary statement the most effective. So some examples of summary statements to help you out. The Boys and Girls Club of Sweet Home, the only provider of after-school programs for low-income children in the community, seeks funding to build a playground at its facility to provide opportunities for outdoor physical activity. Here's another example. RDI seeks funding to develop a training program that addresses an urgent need for federal grant writers in rural Oregon in response to unprecedented federal funding for rural recovery, infrastructure, and energy projects. So what we're going to ask you to do, again, is take a couple minutes and write a sentence. Here, I'll put this back slide so you can keep remembering this. And then we're going to break up into small groups to kind of brainstorm with each other and help each other write it. Also, if you've already written your sentence, you can bounce it off of another person in your small group. So I'll be quiet for a minute and let you think, and then we'll go. Freya, somebody asked for the summary statement examples in the chat, and my technology setup here is not going to let me do that. If you can do it. Let's just say there's an iPad involved and a laptop, and it's pretty wonky. It's pretty crazy. It's not as bad as the car sessions, but. Okay, Freya, are you ready?
One moment while I move a couple people around.
Okay.
Give you guys 30 more seconds to think.
Okay.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and open the breakout rooms now.
Welcome back. I hope that you guys were able to work through some of your projects in a way that made you able to sort of get some clarity around what it is that you're asking for. Does anybody want to ask a question based on what they talked about in their group, or share their statement, or anything?
One thing we talked about in our group was that there's a lot of need for new buildings and trying to figure out like where funding would come from for like new building projects.
That's great. And we'll talk about in, I think, the next session, I can't remember, sorry. One of future sessions, we will talk about that there are that funders give grants in different ways. Some just focus on things like buildings and capital, some just focus on programs, some do a little bit of both, and how to research funders so that you know what it is exactly that they fund. So we'll definitely get to that. Anything else?
So at the last series of classes that I took with you guys, you talked about, it was a Meet the Funder class, and you talked about building that relationship with your funder, you know, and that just really hit home for me. And so I've been really trying to work on that versus, you know, applying for grants right now, just because I think that gives you a better idea of what they're going to fund.
I think that's great, Allison. And we'll talk about that when we talk about how to research funders as well. So I appreciate you bringing that up. This idea that it's not a, it's a relationship, and it's not just you going in cold asking them for money. There are ways to find out whether or not they will fund your project and whether it's a good fit. And I think building relationships ends up paying dividends when you do go to apply for grants, for sure. So I'm glad you brought that up. Okay, well, hopefully you guys have been able to do some good work thinking about the projects that you are working on. I will mention, I should have mentioned this at the beginning, that I am not great at monitoring the chat. I try to glance at it every once in a while, but Freya is the person monitoring the chat. So if you're sending direct messages, you're way better off sending them to her than me. So I apologize for not mentioning that earlier in the session. So next I want to talk a little bit about more about project planning. So, but in the email that we sent you in advance of this session, there was a thing attached to it called the project charter. That particular document in some circles is also known as a case statement. Essentially, this is a document that you can create that includes all the different components of your project as you plan it or your program, such that when a grant opportunity comes up, you're already halfway ready to respond to it. You know what I mean? You already have the project defined, you have the budget, you have the summary statement, you know, all of the things that you need for your project are in one place. One of the reasons this is helpful is, as many of you know, is sometimes these grant opportunities come out of left field and they're due in a week, and and you have to scramble, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about that. But sometimes it's nice if you have sort of a project charter or a case statement for each one of the projects that you're thinking about. Then you can turn those around without it being so painful. So what I will say is, as part of these 5 sessions that you're going to be involved in, if you have a particular project in mind and you want to populate this charter as we go along, where you're putting your summary statement in, and then you're putting your budget in, and then you're putting your outcomes in, et cetera, then by the end of all of these sessions, you will have a completed project charter, which may be a valuable tool for you. For those of you, when you signed up, who said, I don't even know what's happening here, I just want to know what a grant is, don't make me do any homework. You are also welcome to participate in that fashion. I just wanted to give you that opportunity. If you wanted to create a case statement or a project charter, we're giving you the tools to do it. Plus, it may help you after the class is over, when you're doing some planning and you're like, I need a tool or something to know what are all the pieces I need to pull together. This particular tool will help you with that. So I am also in the post email after this class going to provide this in Word format, because I think I sent it to you in PDF format so that you can more easily populate it compared to what I gave you. This is a slide that you're going to see throughout all of the sessions. This is basically all the different things that you typically see in a grant proposal. And so we're just going to kind of recap what we covered today. So today we covered mostly the who. Today we talked about trying to make sure that your organization is financially healthy and has a plan for the future, so that when you are asked to provide that to a potential funder, you've got it all dialed in. And we'll talk about some of these other things you see on the screen in later sessions. Okay, so some homework, should you choose to do homework, because we're all grown-ups here and you can do whatever you want. The first thing is the summary statement that you created. You're welcome to keep working on it, and then you can import it into the project charter that you created. So you have a little piece of the puzzle that you can put in that document. The other thing is to remember, we talked about getting everything in one place. Consider gathering a list of organization documents that are going to be important into one place for easy access. The last thing I will say is that the next session is going to be about budgeting. Some people, if they're working on a particular project or program, or if they're wrestling with their organizational budget, just because it's budget season for some people right now, may find it valuable to bring your own budgets next week. So if there's something you want to work through, we're going to have some exercises and some breakout groups that will help you work through your program budgets and your organizational budgets. So bring yours if you have them. If you've never done a program budget before and you don't know what I'm talking about, and it's okay to show up without anything, because we have some standard examples we can use to show you what we're talking about. But for those of you who would find that useful, I want to make sure to give you that opportunity. A couple of things that I wanted to mention that I forgot that have no particular relevance, I'm just bringing them up right now, is The first is someone, Freya mentioned that in the chat there was a question about having background checks for volunteers, and Beth kindly suggested setting up an advisory board or advisory committee to the board if somebody is not able to be a full board member. And I just wanted to mention that, first of all, that's a great idea if for some reason that gets you around the background check requirement for your nonprofit. If somebody is not able to complete a background check but can still contribute to the organization, they can do it as an advisor to the board or part of an advisory committee. The other reason an advisory committee to the board is great is if somebody's too busy to be a board member and you just need their expertise for 5 questions a year, then putting them on some kind of an advisory board is helpful. The other thing I find an advisory board is great for is people who are thinking about being on the board, but they're not quite sure and they just want to get a taste of it. You could put them on some kind of advisory board or advisory committee. The other thing is if your board has separate committees, like if you have a finance committee or if you have an events committee, it's okay to put non-board members on those committees, you know, and have it be a mix of board members and non-board members. It's a great way for you to cultivate new board members by sort of having an on-ramp and having different opportunities for board members to be involved. So I want to make sure to talk about that. And the other thing I forgot to mention is during the registration process, one of the people who registered, and I apologize, I didn't remember who, asked a question in terms of program planning when you're trying to develop a program, talked about logic models. And I just want to make sure that I introduce that vocabulary term into this room in case you ever see it. When somebody asks you about for the logic model for your program, essentially they're asking you for the inputs, like who are the people participating in your program. They're asking you for the activities that you're going to inflict upon those inputs. So we're going to have an after-school program. That after school, that it will include children from these schools, and that's your inputs. It's going to have activities. So those activities will include, you know, art class, field trips, etc. And then what are the outputs that you're trying to, and the outcomes that you're trying to achieve. So that's what a logic model is. I will tell you that we are not going to cover that in a lot of detail in this class, just because it's a more complex type of grant proposal, and this is not a complex class. So I am happy to talk about logic models. My suggestion, if somebody's really wanting to do a deep dive into logic models or its sister term, which is theories of change, that would be a really good opportunity to connect with Kelly Nonprofit Consulting and spend an hour talking about that. And she is probably a wealth of information on that particular topic. Okay, those were my 2 things I forgot to say that I wanted to say. This is the list of our upcoming Thursday dates. So we're going to be getting to know each other over the course of this month, and it's going to be super fun. And lastly, and most importantly, I want to thank the 2 foundations that are funding this class. The reason that we are able to keep the class fees so low is that the Ford Family Foundation in Oregon and Siskiyou County, California, and Sherwood Trust in the Walla Walla Valley in Eastern Washington are actually providing grant funding for this class. So thank you to them. And then I will go ahead and stop my slides. We are miraculously running a little bit early. So I will say, for those of you who are saying, yay, I've got 15 minutes that I can go do something else, then we welcome you to go on with your day, and we look forward to seeing you next week. If there are other people who have other questions or things they want to talk about, I am happy to stay on and answer questions. It's a pleasure to see all of you, and I look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll see you next week.